Welcome to the ILMA Sustainability 5-Minute Tech Talk. Today's topic is Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1, 2, and 3 is a classification system used to categorize, measure, and track greenhouse gas emissions, or GHGs, for an organization. This system is part of a larger environmental, social, and corporate governance, or ESG push, as well as climate change. Now, regardless of your views on climate change or ESG, there is value in conducting a high-level scope study, as lowering your overall GHG impact correlates with more efficient and thus less costly operations. Although it seems more like a recent concept, the system first appeared in the 2001 Greenhouse Gas Protocol. 5 years later, ISO completed its development of 14064, which outlines a detailed methodology for developing, conducting, and verifying a GHG inventory for your organization. When you think of GHGs, the first molecule that usually comes to mind is carbon dioxide. This is because the molecule accounts for 76% of global GHG emissions. However, there are other emissions that include methane, which accounts for 15%, nitrous oxide, which accounts for roughly 6% of emissions, and fluorinated gases such as sulfur hexafluoride, perfluorocarbons, and hydrofluorocarbons, which account for 2% combined. Before we dive into Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, we first need to talk about boundaries. How an organization sets up its boundaries determines which entities, such as subsidiaries, joint ventures, partnerships, and more, and assets will be included in the inventory. There are 3 general approaches recommended by the GHG protocol: equity share, financial control, and operational control. If you use an equity share approach, your organization accounts for GHG emissions from operations and assets according to equity share in that operation. A financial control approach has you account for 100% emissions over all organizations and assets that you have 100% financial control of. An operational control approach is similar in that you account for 100% of GHG emissions for organizations and assets that you have 100% operational control of. Pick the approach that best fits your organization, but it is important to stick with that approach when comparing changes to your emissions with time. The following table explains a high-level overview of these approaches. A relevant example to our ILMA membership would be how you handle leased vehicles for your organization. An equity and financial approach would not account for these, whereas an operational approach would. Now let's dive into the details of each of the scopes. First up is Scope 1 emissions. These are direct emissions that occur from sources that are controlled or owned by your organization. Items would include mobile combustion sources such as company vehicles and trucks, stationary combustion sources such as boilers that are used to generate steam for heating and processing, or furnaces that burn fuel for heating. Process emissions from manufacturing, such as the CO2 generated in the production of cement or some other product, and fugitive emissions such as leaks from refrigeration or air conditioning systems. Basically, if you are burning a fuel at your facility and it generates a GHG, it falls within your Scope 1 emissions. A good question related to Scope 1 emission is, what about electric vehicles owned by the company? If the vehicles are charged from electricity generated from the grid, then these would be considered Scope 2 emissions and not Scope 1. That's a great segue into Scope 2 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions that are upstream of your organization. They are probably the easiest to calculate as they relate to purchased energy from a utility provider, such as electricity, steam, or heating and cooling. For most of us, our monthly utility bills serve as a great starting point for our Scope 2 emissions, although it may be necessary to contact your utility provider as a source of the energy provided, say for electricity with hydro, wind, solar, coal, nuclear, natural gas, all have different GHG contributions. Now we come to the "there be dragons" portion, or the Scope 3 emissions. These can be significantly more complicated and time-consuming to determine, as they deal with indirect emissions both upstream and downstream of your organization. An easier way to think about this is emissions generated along the value chain for your organization. Upstream activities could include business travel, such as airplanes, trains, business mileage using private vehicles. Employee commuting to work would also fit in this category. The cradle-to-gate emissions of all purchased goods and services also would be another good example of upstream Scope 3 emissions. Downstream activities could include transportation, storage, and distribution of produced products, as well as the end-of-life treatment for the produced products. Given the complexity and breadth of Scope 3 and given it's outside your organizational boundaries or direct control, why study it? Well, if you look at the Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of a very famous company, Apple, it tells a story in that 99% of their emissions sit in the Scope 3 bucket. Now, there are numerous free resources for those who would like to learn more about Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and the US EPA website is a great starting point. Finally, although much of the current focus is on defining and measuring emissions, the real goal should be in utilizing the information to allow you to make better decisions related to your business. Thanks for tuning in to another ILMA Sustainability Tech Talk. Cheers.